his mystery, and Ted wanted to solve it on his own. Chapter 3. Stakeout. There's no such thing as a shortcut in Plattsford, Nebraska. The streets and roads run straight north and south or straight east and west. As the crow flies, the Anderson farm was only 1.5 miles from his school. As the bike rolls, it was twice that far. To get where he was going, Ted had to ride west on F Street for 1/2 mile, then turn right and travel the full 1 mile length of Main Street, then turn left onto County Road 7 and head out of town toward the intersection with Route 92. But Ted didn't mind the distance. It was still a beautiful day, and out on the prairie, 3 miles isn't much. Besides, the ride gave Ted some time to come up with a plan. Because there's also no such thing as sneaking up on someone in west central Nebraska. Most of the land is flat as a boot print. There are some little hills, but nothing that'll hide a kid on a bike for more than a minute or two. There are small stands of trees here and there, but mostly along creek beds or where farmers have planted windbreaks. So Ted had to work out a way to get near the Andersons' house without being seen. Until he could prove otherwise, Ted was going to act as if someone was there, watching. He rode along the county road, and when he could see the roof of the farmhouse, he stopped and hid his bike in some weeds. Ted walked out into the tall grass until the Andersons' old barn stood directly between him and the farmhouse. Then, as he walked in a straight line toward the house, the barn kept him hidden from view, in case there was someone in the house, watching. The approach took about 3 minutes, including the time Ted spent flat on his stomach in the grass so people passing in a pickup couldn't see him. Because if someone saw him, chances were good they'd know him. And when he delivered tomorrow's paper at the diner, someone would almost certainly say, "Heard you were poking around at the Andersons' old place." The last thing a detective wants is publicity. When Ted reached the north end of the barn, first he tugged the handle of the big sliding door, but it was chained shut from the inside. So he looked around until he found what he needed, a couple of wide boards that were weathered and shrunk up enough so he could get his fingers into the crack between them. The nails gave way as he pulled on the old siding, and he was able to pry one board out just far enough to wiggle through. Ted had been in the Andersons' barn once before. He'd come with his dad to the auction. The bank had held the big sale on a Saturday, 2 days before the Andersons went to stay with relatives in Illinois. All the tools and farm equipment had been spread out on the front yard and the driveways and the paddock by the barn. There was furniture too, loads of it, and an old upright piano. Mr. Anderson had put on a brave face, and he even came over to Ted's dad to talk and joke a little, just like always. But he didn't fool Ted. The man was hurting inside, all torn up about having to leave his home and his land. And Mrs. Anderson had kept her eyes down and her lips pressed tightly together as she carried out box after box of the canning supplies and the utensils and all the kitchen goods she wasn't going to need anymore. Mandy Anderson was in 4th grade back then, and when Ted had smiled and said hi to her that day, she'd made a face at him and run back into the house. It was over 2 years ago now, but Ted remembered it all so clearly. And he also remembered the promise he'd made himself as the auctioneer banged the gavel down again and again on that bright October morning. This is never going to happen at our farm. Not at my farm. Ted walked to the south end of the barn. He needed to get a good look at the house, but the wide double doors at this end were also chained, no spaces or cracks anywhere. To the left of the doors, there was one window in a small storage room, but it was covered with plywood from the outside. Ted stepped back about 10 paces, and looking up, he saw a wide gap between the hayloft doors on the 2nd story. Some ladder rungs had been nailed to a post, and 30 seconds later, he was up in the loft, with one eye at the opening, scanning for signs of life. His perch gave him a clear view of the backyard, the kitchen door, and the whole north end of the house. Ted wished he had his mom's little binoculars, the ones she used for bird watching. With those, he'd have been able to study the yard around the back porch for footprints. He saw some long grass that might have been stepped on recently, but that could have been deer, or even rabbits. And the porch door looked like it was still boarded up tight, and so did all the ground floor windows he could see. Nothing seemed disturbed or out of place, nothing obvious. No hint of recent human visitors. But Ted wasn't in a hurry. Good detective work takes patience. He had to be home by 4 to start his afternoon chores, but that gave him almost 30 minutes before he had to leave. So he dragged half a bale of hay into the right spot and tried to make himself comfortable. After another careful look at the house, Ted pulled a small black notebook from his back pocket, found a stubby pencil, looked at his watch, and made an entry. May 18th, 3:19 p.m. Got a stakeout spot in the loft. Good view of the house. No activity. 10 minutes crept by. Then Ted thought he heard a thump from the direction of the house. But it could have been from down below in the barn, too. Probably just that loose board banging in the afternoon breeze. After 5 more minutes, Ted was tempted to go outside and sneak right up to the house. He wanted to do a walk around, look at every window, check the area for footprints, put his ear against the wall and listen for sounds, things like that. Detective work. But he stayed put, and a while later he made another log entry. 3:41 p.m. No suspects observed. One possible noise. No solid clues. And as Ted tucked the notebook in his pocket, he admitted that whoever he'd seen that morning might be long gone. And then he faced the fact that he might never know who it was. He even reconsidered the idea that he might have imagined the face. He stood up, stretched, walked to the edge of the hayloft, and then carefully backed down the ladder to the ground floor of the barn. Time to head for home. 3 new calves had been born in the last week, and 2 of them weren't steady enough to be out in the pastures yet. They were inside in 2 different holding stalls, 1 cow and her calf in each. The mothers took care of feeding the calves, but it was Ted's job to feed and water the cows and clean out the stalls every afternoon. It was his favorite chore. The calves were shy and awkward, and they always made him laugh, and the animals liked him. His dad knew that, which is why he gave the job to Ted. The boy had a natural talent for putting animals at ease. Ted felt like he could tell what they were thinking. Sort of the way a good detective can figure out what's running through a criminal's mind. Except a newborn calf is probably less complicated than your average crook. Back at the north end of the Andersons' barn, Ted found a short piece of iron pipe, and before he went outside, he used it on the loose board, bending the rusty nails down flat. He didn't want to get poked or scraped as he wriggled back through the opening. It would also make it easier to get in the next time. Maybe he'd come back on Saturday. He'd bring some food and a thermos and those binoculars. Then he could set up a real stakeout, take a good long look around, and figure out if anything was going on. Ted pushed the board aside, and as he backed out, the sudden brightness of the afternoon sky almost blinded him. But he could see clearly enough to be sure it was a girl. She was right there, leaning with her back against the barn, waiting for him. She wasn't big, and she wasn't holding a gun or a knife or an axe, but that didn't stop Ted's heart from pounding away like mad. As he blinked and tried to look brave, the girl glared at Ted the way a cat looks at a dog who's come one step too close. And in a voice that sounded all twangy and nasal, she said, "Are you gonna tell on us?" When Ted gulped and sort of stuttered, she stepped away from the barn and squared her shoulders at him, her fists tight, eyes narrow. "Well, are you? Are you gonna tell?" And because he couldn't think, and because this girl looked like she might take a swing at him, Ted said the only thing that made sense at the moment. "Tell? No, I'm not telling." "Promise?" Ted nodded. "Promise." With his chest thumping and his mouth dry as straw, Ted was certainly surprised, and he was also confused by the sudden face-off with an angry girl. Still, as a detective, Ted was thrilled. The case of the face in the window had just blown wide open.